Where do we start, really? Where does this belief in the use of punishment in regulation of the use of substances come from, really? It has a very, very long history in the regulation of forms of use of alcohol, of course. So the history goes back for hundreds of years. And the interesting thing is, yes, there were some of the first reactions. They used a lot of punishment towards certain uses of alcohol. And I would say it's the same thing with drugs. I always say it's a war on drugs. No, it's not a war on drugs. It's a war on people. It's a war on certain segments that use some sorts of drugs. So I think this should be pointed out just as a starting point. It's not a war on drugs, it's a war on people. I start with I try to translate what Johs Andenæs once said. This was 25 years ago, and he was summing up experiences, his experiences using in the penal law field, and he was saying, concerning drugs, we have the biggest misuse of punishment in the 20th century, he said. So he was sort of summing up the good things and all the mistakes done. And when it comes to drugs, he said, this is probably the worst experience we had with the use of drugs. With punishment, sorry. The second quote here is from Bewley Taylor, who also sorts up the penal way of thinking, using punishment. And he said, put simply, this is a suppression through criminal law of illicit production, supply, and consumption of drugs. And this has been a way of thinking and reflecting, at least since the UN Convention of 1961. This has sort of been an international dogma of the use of punishment. As Harry says in his book, Chasing the Scream, he points out that what they actually got was a switch from the war on the drugs in the prohibition era towards the war on alcohol, towards the war on drugs. So he said that they created this big police machinery, you know, working, trying to get the bad guys in organized crime and alcohol. And when they ended the war on the prohibition era in 1933, you got this big police units, highly corrupted, and some of the most dubious groups ever created in policing, and they had nothing to do. And said, okay, let's start chasing drugs. We have a drug problem. So what they actually did was sort of a shift from alcohol to drugs, and I think he describes it in that book in a very good way. The European history is much more complex, but I would say that it's impossible to understand the European context and European regulation without understanding the pressure from the US. The US has all the time been the one pushing towards the use of punishment and trying to regulate the field of drug use and drugs. And I would point out one specific point in Norwegian history where you can see this rather clearly, and that was the year around 1970, when the old law, løsgjengerloven, the law on vagrancy, was actually made a big switch from criminalizing the state of being drunk in public. They decriminalized it in 1970, and there was big discussions around this. But overnight, they actually decriminalized forms of using alcohol. This, of course, was a law that that they had to change because it was socially very, very bad. It was a law that said that it was prohibited for anyone to be drunk in public. But did the rich people go and work for years? No, of course not. You ended up with the same poor people. So this was a law that was extremely unsocial, and it was not doing much good. It was doing a lot of harm. But so at the same time, we changed this law, but at the same time, you start hunting hippies instead. You go for drugs. So you can see from the figures that comes here. You can see that in 1968 we had 201 drug cases in Norway that was investigated. And as you can see through the 70s, this number grows. But in the 90s, it says like bang. So from 1968 until 1998, you had not 150%, you had an increase in 150 times. So from 201 cases to 30,298. 291. So this was an extreme growth in use of police resources in the field. Of course, there was also growth in use, but that was much, much, much smaller. So this is a reflection of the use of police resources in the field. Does punishment work? That's a tricky question to answer, really. But the theories about it, of course, is I think that most criminologists and also penal law experts point out since World War II that the limited effects of punishment when it goes to try to make people behave according to the laws. So it's been a skeptical move towards the use of punishment, and in penal law, everyone said that this is a last resort. So don't use punishment if you can use other things. But what about crimes that are rational? Yeah, maybe. What about the normative effects? That's the one I think is coming up all the time now. They have a belief that punishment is much better than, let's say, information and other things, campaigns. What about deterrence? That's been sort of the basic line in punishment. Try to scare people away from use. Is punishment crime prevention? That will be the big discussion now, I think. When the report comes in the end of this year, the NOU, I think the big discussion will really be on crime prevention. Just be prepared. Because a lot of forces would say, we need punishment, or else we can't prevent crime. Niels Christie pointed out one thing that was very, I think he was a very wise man saying, the most dangerous use of drugs is the political use of drugs. That's a very good line, isn't it? I wish it was me who had said it, but now I've said it. So I think the whole discussion about using a penal law and using a punishment against the drugs has to do with politics. It doesn't have to do with if you know it works, or if it's good, or the effects and so on. No, it has to do with showing political force, doing something, and so on. So the whole rhetorics around this. And it's, of course, the symbolic effects of using punishment. Punishment is much, much better than all other things, because then you really show that you're strong and you're using force and so on. You've seen this extreme increase. And the top year, I think, in Norway was in 2013, when we had 47,000 reported drug crimes. 47,000. That's a huge number. There's been a drop since that time. We've gone down to like 33,500 in 2017, but that has also been a crime drop in all other forms of crimes also. So we have to take that into mind when you think about this. When you go and look at these cases, you think, maybe it's okay anyway, because if you catch the real big ugly guys, then maybe it's good to use punishment, of course. But when you look up the people that you actually catch, you find half of these cases are breach of law concerning medicines and drug, legemiddelloven, which is actually they take users. So half of it is users. But when you look at also the penal law, nearly all of it has to do with possession of drugs. And it's usually not much, it's some grams, and it's usually cannabis or amphetamines. That's the ugly truth. 2 to 3% of these cases can be called serious cases or serious drug crimes. So we have these extreme numbers, which is mainly use and possession of drugs. That's the reality. And it's also that we don't, of course we don't punish all users, we punish a segment of users. We punish the poor, we punish the miserable, we punish the black, and the marginalized. All research point in this direction. And it's nothing new, we know it. These laws are extremely bad when it comes to the social treatment and picking out vulnerable groups. So now I'm going to round up. I used all my time already, but you can say, well, maybe punishment, if you look at costs and benefits, if the benefits are better than the costs, maybe, of course, maybe we should try to push on using punishment for some more years then. And of course, I don't say that it doesn't have any criminal preventive effects. The problem usually is that it's very good for the people who's not going to be users anyhow. That is usually the thing about crime prevention. It works on all the other peoples who are not in a situation where they are in a risk zone. The people in the risk zone, I wouldn't say that they probably have very, very low effects. The costs in human, but if you look at the cost in human suffering using punishment, it's so immense that, it's very hard to defend such a system. And this is one of the points I would really point out. I say that this is to use punishment does not prevent crime. It does the opposite thing. It actually makes crime. It produces failure. It produces dope fiends, junkies, and all these groups of people. They're actually sort of producing the problem. It produces crime. So, and I think that is one of the absolutely most miserable side of the whole thing. And it has very negative effect for the justice system and the police. They go in, then we have, you know, penal laws are affected by it in a negative way. Economic costs are immense. But I would stop now with a sort of a little positive input, because I think things are changing now. And I think there are many reasons for it. One are international changes, but I also would point out the thing that Nils Christie once said, that drugs are suitable enemies. It's a good enemy, the drug, you know. But today we have so many other suitable enemies. We have terrorism, we have immigration problems according to immigration, we have pollution, we have all environmental problems, and so on and so on. All of these points so that maybe it's time to sort of relax when it comes to drugs. But the drug problem is nothing concerned to a planet that goes totally bonkers. And I will also point out there are much better ways of regulation. Thank you.